but at least maybe that will make it easier to do the essays in some way. Immanuel Kant is the precursor to psychology, so think of him in the psychology camp, the what's in our nature, what's in our nurture kind of stuff, and that's where Kant is coming from. Now, an ethical alternative is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes is a complicated and interesting individual. He lived from 1588 to 1679, lived a rather long life. And, okay, basically his approach to ethics, kind of what we're doing through the course is finding different approaches to ethics. Aristotle being humanism, Aquinas being religion, Kant being kind of that it's in your head, that it's psychological, and Hobbes a rather different alternative. Hobbes, the idea that ethics is a contract, an agreement between people. In other words, that you sign a pact, or whether or not you sign a pact, you agree to a pact, and that's how you act ethically with other folks. That's where Hobbes is coming from. Now, in terms of how to understand it, first of all, the book, I think, on Thomas Hobbes won't be particularly much help. The book does a couple things. First of all, the book is not an original source. It's something about Thomas Hobbes. And first of all, the beginning of the discussion in the Elements is quite good. It explains his social contract theory, and so it's just a good review of what it is that Thomas Hobbes is saying and what we'll be talking about as point one. So the book isn't bad there. But then the book, in the second half of what it discusses, talks about the prisoner's dilemma. And it sets up this scenario called the prisoner's dilemma. And it talks about it for a number of pages. And a number of books reproduce that, and it's used a lot. But I guess the bottom line is, at least in my opinion, the prisoner's dilemma is very nice, but it's got nothing whatsoever to do with Thomas Hobbes. In other words, it's a lousy example of trying to illustrate Hobbes. Hobbes, I think, has an interesting position, not a hard position to understand, but an interesting one. But I don't think the prisoner's dilemma helps with it at all. So I would just ask that you probably ignore the reading, but certainly ignore that prisoner's dilemma stuff. So, okay, so how to get at Thomas Hobbes? Well, it pretty much is going to depend on the lecture, and the lecture is going to go, I guess, as some of these do go, in a way that doesn't seem to like it's ever going to get to ethics. But I think that may be the way to understand Hobbes. The reason is, Hobbes gives a genuine alternative to ethical theory, an interpretation, an alternative that's being considered widely in philosophy, religion, and other areas in the 20th century as somehow or other a viable alternative in ethics. But here in the 20th century, people are just beginning to tackle it. Hobbes dies a long time ago, but no one really tackled his theory as an ethical theory until into the 20th century, and probably actually almost until about 1950. And from that time on, people have tackled it a great deal. It's probably discussed more than any other approach to ethics, whether it be in religion or in philosophy or other areas. And so Hobbes is important in ethics, but not yet a finished product. In other words, what Hobbes gives us as ethics is a very, if you will, rudimentary beginning. It's going to need some filling in. And that filling in did not occur at all until into the 20th century. But there are some reasons that it didn't. And that, I think, is the way to understand Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, a lot of people may know about already, is extremely famous in political theory. Now, Thomas Hobbes himself was a real character, which we won't talk about too much, but maybe a little bit. But the main thing is, Thomas Hobbes is very important in political theory. And he was simply so important as a change in the world, so relevant to political theory, that no one really thought about his theory as being an ethical theory. The reason is it was just vitally important for political theory. So Thomas Hobbes, rather immediately at his death, became famous for his political theory, and only now in the 20th century is being considered for his ethics. So what we're going to talk about in point one is what Thomas Hobbes did. He wrote a large book called The Leviathan. Leviathan is a funny word that supposedly means the human animal, kind of a mythical kind of a name, the Leviathan. And that's kind of where Thomas Hobbes was coming from. The book kind of actually tells the story of what he says in the book. But in any case, he has an interesting theory of government. It may seem very simplistic, but it's unbelievably important, particularly in our modern world, to the formation of countries like Iraq and Afghanistan and the redefinition of Egypt and so forth. The position of Hobbes is absolutely vital, really, with that. So anyway, point one is going to be introducing Thomas Hobbes and where he's coming from. Now, Hobbes felt when he did his writing, and he said it this way, that he was coming up with a general social theory. In other words, his proposal was to have a theory for government, for ethics, and for anything else that might be social. Education would be growing eventually, and so forth and so on. But if it was a social area, Thomas Hobbes thought that his theory spoke to it. So he regarded social contract theory as a social theory. In some ways, he was more interested in government, but it was almost coincidental that government somehow found his position to be so relevant. But in any case, that's going to be what we'll do in point one. Then in point two, we're going to, well, the way I think that you won't confuse this essay, the problem is just remembering all the little, or at least a number of the little points. And that is, point one is going to be about Thomas Hobbes, nice and straightforwardly. And I think you'll see there's plenty of detail. You can illustrate it with today's world, so there shouldn't be many problems. Point two is going to be kind of something different. It's going to explain how Hobbes got to be so darn famous. And he got to be so darn famous because of the relevance of his proposal, social contract theory, for the formation of the world's democracies, and particularly the formation of the first two realistic democracies, which were, first of all, England, and then the United States, and France. The French Revolution, of course, didn't go very well, but nonetheless it was a formation of a democracy, at least for a short time. And there are two individuals that led that. They didn't actually, well, let's see. What I'm going to get to in detail is that what they took from Thomas Hobbes was the guideline, the rubric, the format, the fill-in-the-blank form. In other words, if there's a form and there's some missing information, that's what Thomas Hobbes gave to the future of the democracies. In other words, he gave the format out of which the democracies speak. In other words, all democracies that have been formed, period, except for Greece way back when, all democracies that have been formed as what Thomas Hobbes wanted, as social contract theories. In other words, they're formed along this definition that comes from Thomas Hobbes of social contract. And it's really pretty simple. But Thomas Hobbes's interpretation of the social contract was dreadful. In other words, when he filled in the blanks, when he filled in his forms, he did it very badly. So Hobbes is remembered still for the little bit of work he did because it's so vitally important to the future of democracy, but not for how he wanted to fill in the blanks. His book, The Leviathan, is rather dreadful because of its rather weird approach. So, what we're going to do in point two is going to be something kind of different, and you just, well, I think it shouldn't be hard, but it's nonetheless kind of different. And what you're going to do there, and it should not be any problem in order, because you start off with explaining Hobbes. And then after explaining Hobbes and the fact that you couldn't take his theory, his idea, and use his approach to it, his detail, because his detail was dreadful. So you needed alternatives. And the two alternatives were the very famous John Locke, who guided England to its democracy, and then because that worked so well, the United States, our founding fathers, took it over, and so John Locke is unbelievably important, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who shaped the French Revolution. So there have been two social contract theorists historically that have been very important to the formation of the democracies, and it turns out that these two are the only two approaches that democracies have ever used. In other words, every democracy on the planet, every single one that has ever been formed, has taken one of these two approaches. In other words, every democracy on the planet is either a Lockean democracy or they're a Rousseauian democracy. There aren't any other alternatives. They are all social contract theorists. In other words, John Locke regards himself as a social contract theorist. He's taking Hobbes. Jean-Jacques Rousseau regards himself as a social contract theorist. He's taking Thomas Hobbes. But beyond that, they're going their own path. And the paths are very different for Locke and Rousseau. And interestingly, every democracy has always made a choice. They either take the Locke approach or the Rousseau approach. And that's all that's ever been found. So that has shaped political theory ever since. So that's where we're going in point 2. And then point 3, since it is an ethics course, is to see where we are with Hobbes as an ethical theorist. Where we are is that until the middle of the 20th century, there was such a interest in and importance in the political theory of the formation of democracies that Hobbes's idea to be an ethical theory just didn't begin to take hold. In the 20th century, it did. There's a 20th century philosopher named John Rawls who spent his life trying to do this, and now there are a whole lot of other people, at least, heading in that path. So we'll kind of talk about what really is the potential for ethical theory, because what John Rawls did is a nice beginning, but it's not an ethical theory yet. So social contract theory as an ethical theory is not there yet, but it's beginning, and it certainly is a great deal of interest to people. But as a political theory, is awesomely important. So that's where Thomas Hobbes kind of fits in. So, okay, any questions about where we're going with that? Okay, then let's tackle it. The first point is social contract theory. And this is what Hobbes is famous for. Maybe a way, I don't want to talk a lot about Hobbes's life, but maybe a way to introduce it a little bit is to say that Thomas Hobbes is he's the if you will, the definer or the reason for the title of the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. Supposedly, John Calvin is, needless to say, the theologian, the ultra overly religious, overzealous John Calvin, who set up an experimental, if you will, kingdom where you had to follow his path to Christianity or you were in really deep trouble. But in any case, Hobbes, Calvin was a part of that comic strip because the idea is a religious individual who overdoes it, who's too intense, who you know wants to punish you if you don't follow just exactly their way. And Hobbes, for another reason, but very much a reason that fits Thomas Hobbes, and that is Hobbes because he's such a grump. Hobbes lived his entire life, and grumpy is not the word, unhappy, miserable, totally just, it's a wonder that Hobbes lived to be almost 90 years old, because I don't think he ever had a happy moment. He didn't have any friends, he wasn't liked. It's hard to be liked if you're totally negative about everything. And if you're totally negative about everything, it's just kind of hard to relate to somebody like that. And Hobbes was that human being. But somehow or other, he managed to live to 90 years old, so who can explain that one? But in any case, Hobbes remembered in the comic strip because he was such a curmudgeon kind of guy. So why is that relevant? Okay, Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan, huge book. And in that book, he expresses his theory. Well, since he's pessimistic, he has a pessimistic theory. And his theory is just so pessimistic that it's impossible. And so from the very beginning, no one in the vaguest way thought that the details of his theory would work because they were just preposterous. Here's what Hobbes thought. First of all, he thought we were determined. Now, determinism is not too bad an idea. I don't think it's correct, but it certainly is a viable position in psychology. It's the idea that we're determined by our environment, by our parents, by our genes, by situations. And it's not saying we can be predicted, except it is saying we could be predicted if one could unpack all the complexities of our lives. But since you can't unpack all the complexities of our lives, you're not going to be able to predict this. But the bottom line of determinism is that it really says we're just a rat in a cage. It's just our cage is pretty big and we're a pretty smart rat. In other words, we do a lot of things, but they actually all are a function of various influences. We have no free will. So determinism literally says there's no free will. And Hobbes is in that camp. But the problem with Hobbes's vision of that camp is that his vision of humanity was awful. And he simply, well, he had just such a miserable attitude. In any case, he took the idea that, okay, we're determined. So how do you figure out how we're determined? Well, he thought he figured it out. The way we're determined is, we're determined to be bad. He was pretty good at that, so he figured that's what other people were. And he decided that we were determined to be bad people. And in being bad, he thought, we were really bad. So for instance, what do you do in government? Well, he thought government was utterly simple to define, and thus his huge book, The Leviathan. Why is it easy? Because he thought the following. He thought that if two human beings, they were, let's say, both young, one's a man, one's a woman, they end up on a lovely desert island, say they end up on Maui before anybody was there, and there's plenty of fruit to eat, everything is nice, they're in paradise, they ought to be in love and have a good time, just simply live out their lives. No, he felt this man and this woman could never go to sleep, ever, because as soon as one of them went to sleep, he thought the other one would kill him. And why would they kill him? Because they'd want to kill them before the other person would kill them. In other words, he felt stuff like the following. If you were with another human being and you were simply, you exposed yourself, so to speak, in other words, you fell asleep, that he thought that human being would kill you. Why? Because he thought that was the nature of being a human. People just didn't want other people around. So if somebody was around and you had a shot, you were going to kill him. And to him that seemed obvious. Well, that's not terribly obvious and a little bit ridiculous, but that's what Hobbes thought. And unfortunately, he took that and generalized it to a government theory. How did he get there? It was pretty easy from there. He thought that humans needed to be protected from themselves, because after all, they wanted to kill each other. So, to be protected from each other, supposedly, what you did is you chose a dictator, a ruler, and preferably the nastiest one you could find. Like Assad in Syria seems like a pretty good candidate, but the point is somebody who's, really nasty, and they've got to be utterly nasty. Why? Because you've got to be more afraid of them than you are of killing your neighbor. Okay? So why would that work? Well, Hobbes figured we wouldn't all be able to kill each other because the dictator would want people alive that could work for him and give him money and stuff like that. So it seemed to him quite simple. Pick a really rotten character, Assad will do, and make him dictator of the world, oh God, and make him dictator of the world, and people will be so afraid of him that they won't kill each other. So he works that out in this huge book called The Leviathan, and needless to say, the book is garbage. And it's always been regarded as such. It just doesn't make any sense. It might have been an honest attempt, but it just doesn't make any sense. So, you might say, well, okay, if he wrote a book called The Leviathan, and if it's ridiculous, then what in the world is the importance of Thomas Hobbes? Strangely enough, the importance of the guy is these, if you will, 4 words. State of nature, social contract. This is what he did. So you get to be famous if you say the right 4 words, I guess. But anyway, he got to be famous simply for this format. Okay, why is the format important? What Hobbes suggests is the following. Social contract theory is unbelievably simple. Social contract theory just consists of 2 parts. You imagine there's no government. Well, clearly, if you want to form a government, there probably isn't one. So, you imagine there's no government. That's what the state of nature is. For Hobbes, it was kind of like a jungle or something. But in any case, he thought it was a state of nature where there was no government. And then he thought, what is a social contract? In other words, what is a constitution? A constitution is the formation of a government. It's the contract by which you eliminate the state of nature. So, what Hobbes proposed is that you imagine if you want to do government theory, you imagine there's no government, and you define a government. Or you define, you're going to set up a constitution. Okay, so the thing is, how come that's significant? In other words, government theory ought to be about, you imagine there isn't any government, and you form a government. Okay, big deal. But turns out that was vitally important to the future of humanity. And the reason is just kind of interesting, but it's historical. Hobbes does this work probably, I don't know, 1640 or something? And in 1640, when he wrote that book, rather amazingly, government had never gone 1 iota past Aristotle. In other words, you remember Aristotle from the beginning. Aristotle, of course, is from a very long time ago. He had a book on political theory. And remember, it seemed like it was kind of rigged. In other words, it was rigged to cover his tail from getting killed by Alexander the Great. But whether it was rigged or not, the point is, it clearly favored monarchy. Okay, that had been all the government theory anybody had ever turned to. Nobody thought government theory was relevant. The reason is, it wasn't relevant. Government theory had no meaning. Up until 1650, the world was a collection of totalitarian states. In other words, the world, anywhere you went, you simply found tyranny. And so there was no need to define what a democracy would look like or any other type of government, because there just were no options. So the book, The Politics, from Aristotle, was quite acceptable. But the winds of change or whatever were certainly coming about this time. And the change was the following. The democracies were about to happen. Now, in a way, Hobbes saw that coming, but in a way, maybe he didn't particularly clearly see that coming. The main thing is he came up with an idea that needed to be there, because very quickly, by the time after his death, the democracies begin to be formed, and they've been formed ever since. And the democracies needed this idea. They needed it very badly. Okay, why? Well, what Hobbes is saying, and it's awfully simple in those 2 ideas, no government, form a government. Hobbes is saying that you do what you imagine there's no government, and then how do you allow yourself to form a government? Hobbes thought you picked up whatever pieces of various governments you wanted, and then basically put the puzzle together any way you wanted to. In other words, Hobbes thought the way to form a government was to look around at alternatives, decide anything that you might like, but the main thing is define your own government. So what Hobbes is suggesting in social contract theory is that the way to form a government is to pick and choose among other nations and what you like and what you don't like. And what's interesting is that was vitally important, because it wasn't perhaps so vital with Locke and Rousseau, but it has been since then. And here's why. What Aristotle is saying, well, let's get what Aristotle is saying. Aristotle's vision was the following. He thought you studied the alternatives and you picked the best one. You didn't pick and choose. You didn't combine. No combinatorics. You simply chose whichever one. So, if you wanted a democracy, you had to copy Athens. If you wanted a totalitarian state, you probably ought to copy Alexander the Great, so forth. You had to pick the winner and copy it. And that simply wouldn't work in today's world. Well, how to illustrate why Hobbes is important? Let's take recent times. Recently, with the Arab Spring, there's a bunch of nations springing up. There are going to be some more. Maybe they'll make it, maybe they won't, but the point is they're springing up. And a good example, I think, is Iraq and Afghanistan and progressively Egypt, and there, I think, could be a passel more. But in any case, take Iraq. When Iraq was formed, Iraq was kind of a compliment. They're still in a formative stage. In fact, they're somewhere between chaos and making it, but they're kind of doing it. They're almost three separate countries, but they seem to be surviving. But whether they're surviving or not, the point is when Iraq was formed, and they're still almost in a formative state, but when they were formed, they basically had decisions to make because there was ostensibly no government and they needed to form a government. So what were they to choose? Well, part of what they had to choose, after all, they had to in some way pay lip service to the United States because they needed the money. And so in some way or other, they had to come out like America. But at the same time, they weren't a Christian country, which America still, at least ostensibly, is. And they clearly are an Islamic country. So they picked and chose. They looked at the world, and when they formed their government, they considered themselves a social contract theory. And via social contract, they knew they didn't have any government, so they formed a government. Their government idea was, basically they took a Lockean democracy, they took checks and balances, basically the detail of their constitution and the way their situation works is basically copying the United States. I mean, there are three states, the Kurdish state and so forth, that have very much the same power of our individual states, and then they have their just all the rest of it. In other words, they have the executive, the legislative, the judicial, just like the United States does. But they're not in any way, shape, or form a Christian country. They're an Islamic country. So they basically are a Lockean democracy under an Islamic umbrella. So their idea is that they are an Islamic country that has a Lockean form of democracy. And that's their notion. It's a combinatoric that they obviously had to have. There's no way that Iraq could have been formed and take totally the US model. They're an Islamic country. There's no way they could do that. At the same time, there's no way they could take a totally Islamic model because up until the time of Iraq, there'd never been an Islamic democracy, ever, in the history of the world. So, the ability to combine the best ideas has turned out to be terribly relevant. It was relevant with Afghanistan, it's relevant with Egypt, it'll be relevant with the other formative situations. And I think the best example of it is probably Iraq, because Iraq just seems so clear. And a lot of people know about Iraq. Basically, the three countries fighting it out, and they may make peace with themselves. Turns out they're building a pipeline and trying to share their oil. They can, realistically, it's always about money. So if they can just share the oil, they really got nothing to fight about. Okay, Thomas Hobbes, the first point, well, I think he can write it numerous ways, but there ought to be plenty of information there. Any questions about that social contract discussion? Yes?
Would Turkey be considered an Islamic democracy or more of a secular democracy?
I don't know what Turkey would call themselves. I think they call themselves a sectarian democracy because they've been so busy trying to get along with the European Union. I think they probably say they were a sectarian democracy, but I don't know. They're probably realistically they're more or less it would seem like they're an Islamic democracy, but I don't imagine they call themselves that because they're really trying to work with the European Union, so they're trying to look like Europe.
Or what would a better,
If I'm not mistaken, I mean that seems to be what Turkey's up to.
or what would like a better example be?
I'm sorry?
What better example than Turkey?
Of what?
An Islamic democracy.
Oh, Islamic democracy is Iraq and Afghanistan and maybe Egypt may end up that way, but Iraq and Afghanistan are beautiful examples, I think.
Or like pre-revolution Egypt, would that be considered one, or?
Pardon?
Like pre-revolution Egypt would be considered one, or is that?
No, pre-revolution Egypt was really a pure democracy.
Oh, okay.
Other questions? All right. Hopefully no one will have any trouble with that one. I think there's different ways to write about it. You can illustrate it with Iraq or whatever you like. And if you want to write something about Hobbes just to show why he doesn't make any sense, but however you want to handle that ought to be okay. Okay, now let's get started with this, and then we'll see where we end up there. But let's get started anyway. Social contract theory became relevant after Hobbes' death. They couldn't take the detail of Hobbes, so they needed other changes. Fortunately, the first change that came along was an awfully good one, John Locke. And then a little bit later, actually at the time, Jean-Jacques Rousseau is alive during the American Revolution, and of course he's alive at least until the French Revolution. So, John Locke. John Locke is so famous in the United States that a lot of people think he ought to be an American or think he is an American. But he was, of course, a Britisher. His ideas were taken over in 1688 in what's called in England the Glorious Revolution. In other words, England in 1688 had a revolution in their country that was glorious in that it didn't involve any bloodshed. It was simply an agreement to form a government based in checks and balances, because England had always up to that point been fighting Catholics and Protestants, and just numerous battles that were caused a lot of bloodshed. And England eliminated those when they took over John Locke and the checks and balances. And Locke, what made Locke famous was the year 1688, where England took over the checks and balances and took over the theory of John Locke. Okay, and then John Locke's theory worked beautifully in England for the next 100 years, and so rather naturally our founding fathers, when because after all they were British, they may have wanted to be free, but they were British people, and they clearly took over John Locke's theory because it was working so darn well in England, but they just wanted their own version of it. Okay, John Locke's theory of checks and balances, most people are pretty familiar with, and I think it's pretty easy to write about, and you're welcome to explain it as you wish. But basically, John Locke's theory is, well, John Locke wrote 2 books. Actually, they're one book, but they were divided into 2. And the books were called the Treatises on Government. Treatise is an old word for book, really. And so in those days, if you wrote books, you usually seemed to call them treatises. So they wrote treatise on this and treatise on that. And these were 2 treatises on government. Okay, John Locke wrote 2 treatises on government. Interestingly, they were 800 pages, and those 800 pages describe in endless detail checks and balances. Rather amazingly, if you were to read those 800 pages, what you'd see is all of those 800 pages describe the complexity of checks and balances. In other words, this will check against this will balance against that, and on and on and on. But 800 pages of it, for goodness sakes. Because with John Locke, there's a great deal of complexity. Most of that complexity is maintained with the United States because we have a very effective and very workable system of checks and balances. That, simply checks and balances and has always worked out so far. One might question in the last few years because our government can't get anything done whatsoever. Whichever party you're for, it doesn't really matter. The point is our government at the moment is completely stymied by all their infighting, and we're doing absolutely nothing. But seemingly we can get away with that, and I'm sure we're going to do it for several more years. I mean, let's face it, they kicked the can down the road on this budget thing, and now they think it's going till January, and then they'll kick it down the road again and just do it for a couple more years. But anyway, we seem to make it. So anyway, John Locke's checks and balances, but they have worked historically beautifully. What are the checks and balances? Well, there are three components. There's supposed to be an executive branch, in the case of the United States, of course, a president. There's supposed to be a legislative branch, and John Locke saw a lot of the details that exist today. He thought pure democracy, in other words, one man, one vote, period, would lead to chaos. So he proposed what's always been accepted, what really is not a pure democracy, but what's a polity, and the United States is a polity, because we're both a combination of one man, one vote, but we also have the power of the states via our Congress and via the Senate and the college that basically elects presidents rather than necessarily a majority rule. So there's an executive branch, there's a legislative branch with always two divisions, and there's a judicial branch. And basically John Locke is visioning basically a Supreme Court and the checks and balances. In other words, maybe life terms for one group, certain other terms for other groups, in order to somehow check and balance. Seems like in the checks and balances, you almost wonder if the judicial doesn't come out on top because of the lifetime situation and sometimes the amazing power of the judicial. I think in the last year and a half or so ago, when the Supreme Court, I think, surprised everybody when they voted to keep Obamacare, and that pretty much surprised the world. But they have enormous power and are very hard to overturn. Anyway, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial are three separate components. Locke envisioned those components, and he envisioned checks and balances that would balance out one's authority with the other. In other words, a president supposedly can do a whole lot, but they cannot raise money and they cannot go to war without the permission of the Congress. And a legislative branch supposedly controls money and the ability to go to war, but they have to, if need be, override vetoes by an executive that will be awfully hard perhaps to override. And the judicial kind of sits there and looks at the whole thing, which gives them an enormous amount of power. But anyway, those three branches have worked awfully well, exactly as John Locke defined them. I think the perfect example, I think if you want to find a bad example, it would be our government in the last couple of years and the ineptness we found. But the good example, I think, is back a few years ago when, if you remember, in Florida, there was a puzzle with who was the president of the United States because they couldn't settle it. And it finally was decided in Florida, and finally decided over something like 500 votes or something, and then the decision was that Bush had won and Gore had lost. But in any case, the thing is, for about 10 days, we didn't know who the president of the United States was. And it didn't seem to matter to people. In other words, we figured, oh, they'll get it figured out eventually, and it simply was all right. So our checks and balances really do keep the United States rather stable. So that's what John Locke does. John Locke contributed the checks and balances, which have been the major way that governments have been formed ever since. Almost everyone goes by checks and balances. Any questions about that so far? All right. Uh, Another good point about Locke, maybe it's just because it's totally unlike Hobbes. Locke was totally confident of government. Locke did say in his treatises that you can rebel, you can have a revolution against the government. In other words, theoretically, our Constitution allows that we can have a revolution against the United States. But we're not going to have a revolution against the United States because it works. And this is what Locke thought. He thought revolution was possible, but it wasn't going to happen because government would work. If you follow the checks and balances, you'd work things out, if not immediately, eventually. And therefore, government would, he thought, always work. So he was, John Locke is a smiley face thinker. And that was a part of the reason that his theory has been so successful. Okay, and then the other side of the coin is going to be Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's very different. But where we're going with this is the following. By the time we get Locke and the time we get Jean-Jacques Rousseau with his alternative, we basically have the pattern that all democracies have followed since the beginning. In other words, the United States and France were the first, and since then all the other formations of the countries, and every single one of them, if they're democracy now, this is simply social contract theories about democracies. It's a pattern for setting up a democracy, not for setting up a communist state or a socialist state, and certainly not for setting up a monarchy or a dictatorship. But every democracy on the planet has always been either Lockean or Rousseauian, and that's rather interesting. No exceptions, and there don't seem like there'll ever be any exceptions. Every country that forms will be one of those two basic formats. Okay, how do they choose which one? And it's rather interesting, at least so far it's worked out this way. It doesn't have to, but it has. And that is, if a country speaks French, for whatever reason, if they speak French, or if their original language was French, in other words, think of all the former colonies of France that started out speaking French, and now they speak whatever they speak. But in any case, if a country still speaks French, or originally spoke French, it seems like, without exception, they've always chosen a Rousseauian democracy. Don't know why. If it goes with the culture, or Jean-Jacques Rousseau is certainly a Frenchman, but somehow or other, if a country is French-speaking, or ever was French-speaking, they're a Rousseauian democracy. And if they're not French-speaking, no one else has ever tackled Jean-Jacques Rousseau. It's kind of like you gotta have some French in your background to tackle Jean-Jacques Rousseau. But just an interesting peculiarity. If you think about it.
Sorry, is that why Louisiana still uses a different judicial system than the rest of the states?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not sure I'm positive about that in Louisiana because, but I know they very much have a different system. But I think one could also argue they took it in some way from from other parts of Europe. But I guess it could have been the Rousseauian, but I'm not sure it was. But yeah, they still have some separate ideas in government, no doubt about it. And some of the parishes still work on those formats. But in any case, Jean-Jacques Rousseau has impacted, what's he impacted in today's world? France is still a Rousseauian democracy. They absolutely are proud to be a Rousseauian democracy. The half of Canada is a Rousseauian democracy. It's interesting, there are really, as you know, two Canadas that work very nicely together, sort of no problems. But there's a French-speaking and there's an English-speaking. The English-speaking Canada is Lockean, and the French-speaking Canada is Rousseauian. And interestingly, it makes no difference whatsoever, because they both operate according to checks and balances. They both seem to totally ignore Jean-Jacques Rousseau and his ideas, because you can't do much with Jean-Jacques Rousseau's ideas. And they, obviously, Canada works quite nicely. Gripes about pollution in the United States all the time, but other than that, no problems up in Canada. Okay, Um, Yeah, I think that illustrates. So all the democracies are one or another taking over social contract theory, and most are going to be Lockean, or it seems like in the final analysis they're all Lockean in today's world. The reason being, all of them follow checks and balances. For instance, France, which very proudly is a Rousseauian democracy, and they're very much aware of it, realistically, they're not a Rousseauian democracy because they follow the checks and balances of Locke. So amazingly, Locke's theory of the world, which certainly fits the United States, and people are awfully familiar with, is really the vision of democracies around the planet. So the next thing we want to do is Jean-Jacques Rousseau in detail, but I think this is a good place for a break because we'll take a look at Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who's a peculiar individual, and then we'll take a look at this ethical possibility for social contract theory. So let's take a break for 20 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll do a piece of point 2, and then we'll do point 3. 1778, so he was alive during the American Revolution, and his ideas were the cornerstone of what set the French Revolution going. Okay, Jean-Jacques Rousseau writes a book on political theory, and he calls it The Social Contract. And it's a couple hundred pages, and interestingly, it just doesn't say anything in a couple hundred pages. Yeah. Many people say that Jean-Jacques Rousseau is the most brilliant political theorist of all times. And I'm not quite sure how, because he doesn't say anything. But in any case, his theory, called the general will, is, one has to admit, awfully intriguing. But the thing is, you can't do anything with it. In other words, it's kind of like Kant's theory. You can agree with it, but nothing happens after you agree with it. But the point is, the general will is the same kind of thing. It seems like it's a component of government. It's not a bad idea, but the point is, what do you do with it? But in any case, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's book, The Social Contract, unlike the detail of John Locke. John Locke's giving you 800 pages of endless detail on checks and balances. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is not. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is a right-brain thinker. He's being totally pictorial, and he's basically giving you a theory, an idea, and the idea is the general will. And to say it lacks detail is mild, because it just doesn't have any detail at all. But here's what he does. What he suggests is that a democracy is not formed by checks and balances. And he's writing well after John Locke. He thinks the checks and balances are too detail-oriented. That isn't what people really do. They don't make decisions based in those details. So he thinks the general will has to do with the population and how they feel about a democracy. And his notion of the general will is this, that in order for a democracy to function, and what he means by that is, if it doesn't function, then you rebel against it. So Rousseau is going to be is in a way like Hobbes. He's awfully pessimistic because he doesn't think government's going to work. But he thinks this nonetheless is the best shot that it has. And he thinks that shot is the general will. Okay, the general will is what? It's supposedly the idea that a government is valid or is able to exist only as long as what? As it satisfies the general will. Well, what's the general will? The general will is that a government on any given day does exactly what every single citizen wants it to do, period. In other words, the only way a government can validly survive is if every single member of that government gets exactly what they want from the government that day and every other day. And the first time you don't get what you want, or anybody doesn't get what they want, then you ought to rebel against the government. Well, clearly, that makes no sense whatsoever. And what's interesting is Rousseau is quite brilliant. He's not stupid. He doesn't think that's satisfiable, but he thinks it's an enviable goal. In other words, he thinks the way you form a democracy is realistic. In other words, you don't form it according to some detailed notion about checks and balances, because people don't really even understand them. He thinks you form it around a commitment, a belief, and that belief is that you're part of an organization, a government, that is going to do the absolute best it can to make you a happy camper all the time. And I'm not sure in today's world how many people agree with that on the government, but in any case, whether you do or not, that's the notion. It is idealistic in its own way. Maybe it's brilliant, but the point is it doesn't have any detail, because if you say, okay, I really like the idea, the government really ought to do what I want, that, and I know, and I like to think they're trying or something, but in any case, the thing is, okay, now what? And that just doesn't seem to satisfy anything. But that's where Jean-Jacques Rousseau is, and that's his general will. That's the only, I think the reason maybe that's important in today's world, except for France where they really want to live by it, is the fact that it simply shows why anybody, whether they're Rousseauian democracy or not, is really following John Locke. So John Locke's concepts, rather amazingly, are universal to democracy, which may numerically make him more important than any other thinker in history. I mean, John Locke's fame, John Locke's importance is truly amazing.
Would he have come up with all that without Thomas Hobbes? Would he have been able to do this without Hobbes?
That's interesting.
Curious.
Yeah, no reason why he wouldn't, because he really didn't get anything from Hobbes. He got it from his real life experiences, and he had plenty of them. He was very much in the political sphere of England and learned about the politics of the other components of Europe, and formed his government on what he thought was an idealistic notion, but turned out to work. But yeah, I don't know that he even needed Hobbes, but he certainly takes Hobbes as the idea of a yeah, because basically even his religious idea, which is very important to him, in other words, that government has to be formed on life, liberty, and property, that notion is based in his Christianity, not in anything about Hobbes. So yeah, I guess he didn't need Hobbes. Interesting. You always say interesting stuff.
I try.
Okay. Questions about Rousseau? All right. Let's turn to the alternative now. I would imagine this is probably going to be about 400 words, and that probably isn't too much to say on the ethics, but I think it's a good and simple place to end it, and it's very different. The potential for the ethical interpretation is the following. It's, of course, the idea that if the notion of an agreement, however complex that agreement, works so well in government, then why shouldn't it work in ethics? Or why couldn't it work in ethics? Or why doesn't it work in ethics? And the answer has usually been, as to why it doesn't work in ethics, has usually been, well, first of all, a lot of people are already satisfied with their religious ethics. And many others are satisfied with humanism and so forth. But the point is, why wouldn't it work? Most people think it wouldn't work because, realistically, if you want to form a government, you do it on social contract terms. And that means that you assume there's no government. So, it was rather obvious that Iraq would consider what kind of government to set up, because they didn't have one. it was obvious Afghanistan would discuss what type of government and take it very serious to form because they didn't have one. But we have ethical theories. Most everybody has an ethical perspective. It may be a good one, it may be a bad one, but they have an ethical perspective. And so if you already have an ethical perspective, how can you imagine, if you will, a state of nature? In other words, how can you imagine no ethics? And that's been what slowed down the ethics idea. But the nice thing about John Rawls in the 20th century, although his ethics detail wasn't too good, he had one idea that was very good indeed, and it's kind of set people to rethink the notion of a social contract ethics. And that is, John Rawls suggested this. He suggested that the reason you could use social contract, make it a contract in ethics, even though you already had an ethical position, whether it be Christianity or whatever it be, or humanism or whatever, you could still consider making an agreement. Why? Because Rawls said, realistically, the way to make an ethical system is to imagine a veil of ignorance. In other words, this is only imaginary, but it's a good idea. If you really want to think about ethics, then imagine that you're not in the United States, you're not of a certain age and a certain health and a certain all kinds of things, and a certain background and a certain amount of parental help and so forth and so on. But imagine that you don't know who you're going to be, but you're going to come into society. In other words, you don't know, tomorrow morning, let's say, in society, if you're going to be handicapped or not. You don't know what your ethnic situation is going to be. You don't know what your background is going to be. You don't know what your parent structure is going to be. You simply don't know what your life is going to look like. And if you could imagine that veil of ignorance, then you could realize the complexity of setting up an ethical system. Because we assume an awful lot, depending on our life, family, situation, and so forth. And if we didn't have all those things, we might look at things much differently. And Rawls certainly thought that would lead to looking at things much differently. He wrote a huge book in 1971 that he spent 3 years working on, and it was called Theory of Justice. And it was a bestseller immediately. I'm not sure, I don't think anybody ever read it because it's too long and too complicated, but they heard about it and they liked what they heard. Basically what Rawls proposed is, if you imagine a veil of ignorance, what kind of ethics are you going to define? And he didn't think you'd define Christian ethics because you might turn out not to be a Christian. And he didn't think you'd define Buddhist ethics or any other type of ethics. He thought that you'd have to define some type of a social contract. And he thought that social contract, at least in his vision, was going to be, needed a pattern to make decisions. And he thought that pattern was being fair. And he thought the perfect example of that was if you were to be born and be handicapped. Because he thought handicapped people need assistance. They need things to make a level playing field. They need things to make them fair. And why isn't everything like that? And that was his notion. The problem is not everything is like being handicapped. Fairness is a really good idea, but it doesn't work all the time. The world isn't fair. You don't strive in education, job, and all the rest to be fair. You strive to outdo some people. You strive to take some people out. You strive to do better. And in doing that, you're not necessarily being fair to everybody. Well, that's life. The point is, fairness doesn't completely work, but the idea is good. There ought to be another idea that somehow is right. But anyway, an awful lot of people are thinking about it, and they're thinking about it mainly because of John Rawls's work. So, what can one say about that? That the social contract idea of ethics is interesting. If you can get into the idea, ethics ought to be about, what if I didn't know what my life was going to look like? Would I really be thinking ethics ethics was as simple as I think it is. In other words, I sit here and I think, well, I'm pretty comfortable with my religious view of ethics. What the heck, it's fine. But the point is, would I still have that view of religion if I really was behind the veil of ignorance? And depending on your view of religion, you might. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is, a veil of ignorance, and Rawls wrote this book called The Theory of Justice. I think he overdid fairness, but maybe the idea is a pretty good one. And lots of people are taking a shot at it now. Theologians and philosophers and a number of other people. Okay, any questions about that stuff? All right, so what I'd like to do is spend a few more minutes before we go and see if there's anything that we can do to look at whichever of these philosophers. Next time, we either have a test on Immanuel Kant or on Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes we've kind of covered in 3 points. I think probably everybody's comfortable, but if you think of anything, you're welcome to ask. And the point is, do you have any questions that you may have thought of about Immanuel Kant, or is everybody comfortable? But go ahead and take a look at the notes and see if there's anything you want to ask, and then we'll do a test on one of the two next time.
For Immanuel Kant, I actually missed the book from the beginning, and I didn't get how he was influenced by David.
It's kind of a complicated thing. Did you have at least my notes?
Yeah, I have the notes.
You have those notes. Maybe somebody can give you some more detail, but it's kind of long. It'd be a long story. Other questions? Okay, if anybody thinks of anything, we can certainly deal with that before you take off. So, but anyway, we'll see you all next week, and if anybody has any issues, we'll talk about them.